When I gave my heart to the wrong kind of man, from the wrong side of town, I had a no good plan. I saw my dreams lying in his eyes, and I let them fall when he said goodbye.
All right, I am delighted to see so many of you before the lights went out come out tonight for this special event. My name is Erica Abrams Locklear, and I'm an associate professor in the English department here at UNC Asheville. As someone who teaches and writes about Southern and Appalachian literature, I am especially honored to introduce this all-star lineup. The focus of tonight's event is UNC Asheville's writer-in-residence Wiley Cash's newest novel, The Last Ballad, which fictionalizes the simultaneously heroic and tragic story of Ella Mae Wiggins and the 1929 Loray Mill strike in Gastonia, North Carolina. The book's official release date is today, and we are the first stop on Wiley's tour. I know. Musician Shannon Whitworth will perform ballads sung during the strike, as well as her own original music, and acclaimed author Charles Frazier will join Wiley on stage for conversation. I want to extend a special thank you to the English department for funding tonight's event, as well as the Events and Conferences Office for helping us plan and publicize it. I also want to call your attention to information on the backs of your program. We have another writer coming on November 9th at 7 o'clock. It's the next person in our Visiting Writers series, and that's Avaya Kushner. She'll be speaking in the Laurel Forum of Carpent Hall. So I promise not to spend too much time in the way of introductions, but there are a few things you should know about our guests. Wiley is from Gastonia, and as he explains in interviews, both of his parents were born in mill villages, and his mother's maiden name is Wiggins. Yes, just like Ella Mae. So in some ways, his writing about the event seems inevitable, given his immersion in Southern literature. Yet growing up, Wiley did not learn about the Loray Mill strike. As he says in an interview with Rob Neufeld, his mom was a nurse. His dad was a pharmacist. In the summers, he lifeguarded. Learning about labor unions was not an adolescent pastime. After graduating from high school, he earned his bachelor's degree in literature and language here at UNC Asheville, studying with literature professors including David Hopes and history professors including Dan Pierce. Next, he earned an MFA from UNC Greensboro, followed by a PhD from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. In Louisiana, Wiley studied under well-known African-American writer Ernest Gaines. In 2012, he published his New York Times best-selling novel, A Land More Kind Than Home. Set in nearby Madison County, the novel uses several narrators to weave the complex story of a young boy's smothering during a church service. The book's suspenseful structure makes pages fly, and stylistically, the novel echoes the best of Ron Rash and Lee Smith. In addition to making the New York Times bestseller list in all of its forms, it also won the Western North Carolina Historical Association's Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award, the Appalachian Writers Association's Book of the Year Award, and was named a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize. Wiley published his second novel, This Dark Road to Mercy, in 2014. Like with A Land More Kind Than Home, readers are drawn in from the first page and come to empathize with an unlikely character, a deadbeat father who steals his daughters from foster care after their mother dies. The book enacts mystery writing at its finest. It was a national bestseller and became a finalist for the Mystery Writers of America's Edgar Award. It was also an Indie Next Pick, an Okra Pick by the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance, a Library Read Selection, and an Amazon Book of the Month. And now, 3 years later, we have The Last Ballad, which spends 17 chapters recreating the events leading up to and the aftermath of the Loray Mill strike. The novel gives careful attention to protagonist Ella Mae Wiggins, a real-life organizer who fought to integrate unions and was murdered for her efforts. Through the novel, readers come to understand the dire circumstances in which mill workers lived and died, and readers cannot help but notice the connections to present-day problems in America. Wiley finished the book over a year ago, so its precise commentary on current events is almost uncanny. At one point, two characters discuss the far-reaching clutches of white power as they ride on a train that just departed from Charlottesville, Virginia. Later in the novel, a weekend-long jamboree to honor Confederate veterans in Charlotte begins a long chain of events that end poorly for almost everyone involved. So while the book is an insightful retelling of an important labor struggle that often does not receive its due attention until now, it also provides incisive commentary on contemporary issues of social justice. As readers are swept up in this tale of power, corruption, and those who suffer because of it, Wiley creates relatable characters about whom we care deeply. What first appear as disparate stories converge as the novel progresses, lending a sense of closure, but also the resonating hope that with enough attention to past mistakes, maybe future generations can avoid making them again. Joining Wiley tonight is musician Shannon Whitworth, who has 4 albums: No Expectations, Waterbound, Bring It On Home, and her newest, High Tide. At the same time her music features instruments like the banjo and embraces Appalachian roots, her work also pushes the boundaries of those categories, drawing from jazz traditions and indie rock style. Her website explains the appeal of her newest album like this: whether you're holed up in a chilly Appalachian barn or walking the coast on a hot August evening, Whitworth's High Tide holds universal appeal from the mountains to the sea. The kind of breadth that Shannon's music embodies seems especially fitting to represent the ballads Ella Mae Wiggins created under such adversity. A little later in the evening, Wiley will introduce best-selling author Charles Frazier. And now, I hope that you will help me welcome Shannon to the stage.
Oh. Good evening. It's an honor to be here. All right, this song is maybe one of the kind of men that Ella Mae would have run into. So here it goes. It's called Wrong Kind of Man. When I gave my heart to the wrong kind of man, from the wrong side of town, I had a no good plan. I saw my dreams lying in his eyes, and I let them fall when he said goodbye. Look no further through the eyes of hell. Man with a gun is gonna kill this sweet girl with untied hair. She loved a man that never cared. Well, my father knew how the West was won. He broke my mom until she was done. So she lost her dreams lying in his eyes, and she let them fall when he said goodbye. Look no further through the eyes of hell. Man with a gun is gonna kill this sweet girl with untied hair. She loved a man who never cared. Well, the birds fly south and the leaves turn gold, but Mom and me, now we weren't so bold. 'Cause we swim upstream till it pulls us down. We will reach the shore, though, before we drown. Look no further through the eyes of hell. Man with a gun is gonna kill this sweet girl with untied hair. She loved a man who never cared. Thank you. Wiley.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank all of you for coming. I don't know how many of you are actually out there, but from the applause, it seems like quite a few. And I'm deeply honored that you chose. You could have been anywhere you wanted to be tonight in this wonderful town, in this wonderful area, and you chose to be here. And it means a lot that you came to support me and support Shannon and Charles, because they clearly need as much help as they can get. You know, my plan was to come for Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and stay for the acoustic college band nobody had ever heard of. So here's the band. But thank y'all so much. And before I start, there are a number of people I want to thank, and I know I'm going to leave people out, and I'll apologize in advance for doing that, because there are so many hands that make an event and a book like this happen. First, I want to thank Holly Beveridge and Corey Anderson from the Office of Events and Conferences. I worked with them last year, and they're just pros. They're just wonderful. I want to thank my colleagues in the English department, Erica, for that wonderful introduction, and our fearless chair, Rick Chess, who every Friday, no matter how late he stays or how much work he has to do, sends out a gratitude email every Friday and thanks individual people for the work they did that week, for the small moments they had with students and the things that he observed in a faculty and a department that cares deeply about student success. And it's just, if you have a boss like that, it makes your job incredible. And I want to thank Chancellor Mary Grant, who is dynamic and exciting and also heartbreaking, because she's leaving us. And I am going to choose not to wallow in that sadness, and I'm going to say instead, congratulations, you get to go home. And as someone who spent much of my life trying to go home, I know how happy you are, and I want you to know how happy I am for you. I also want to thank Provost Dr. Joe Ergo for bringing me back to my alma mater in a way that feels wonderful and right. We have a couple of really special guests here tonight. I'm assuming she's here. Ella Mae Wiggins' great-granddaughter, Christina Horton. She had said she was going to be here, and I hope, sure, round of applause, absolutely. She said she was going to make it, and I hope she did. And Christina had just an incredible study of Ella Mae and the events of the Luray strike come out, I believe about a year and a half ago, from a press called McFarland, called Martyr of the Luray Mill Strike, just an exceptional study. And so I've never met Christina. We've talked online, and I'm excited, but because she's Ella Mae's great-granddaughter, I'm a little scared as well. Because Ella Mae was tough, and I imagine Christina is too. So Christina, if you're here tonight. And I also want to recognize my agents, Nat Sobel and Judith Weber, who came down to be with us last night for dinner and who are here tonight. I started writing my first novel, Land More Kind Than Home, in the spring of 2004, and I'll talk about the circumstances of that in a little bit. And I published an excerpt of that in a tiny literary magazine that probably 3 people read, including one of the editors. And the other person who read it was Nat Sobel. And he reached out to me. He got a hold of my email, I assume from the editor, and he said, hey, do you have a novel? Do you have an agent? And I did have an agent at the time. And I said, I'm working with somebody right now. And he said, well, I'll be here if it doesn't work out. And about 2 years later, it hadn't worked out. And I called Nat on a Friday, and I said, I've got this book. It's about snake handling in Western North Carolina. It's about this boy who's smothered in a healing service. It's been roundly rejected by a number of editors in New York City. Will you take a look at it? And he said, sure, send me 50 pages. I can't make any promises. And then a couple of years later, we were looking at a 2-book contract for that novel and for the next novel. So Nat and Judith changed my life, and I cannot thank them enough. Someone else who changed my life who's here tonight is my wife, Mallory. I'm not quite sure where she's sitting, but Mallory lived with this book, The Last Ballad, probably in a deeper way than I did, because I lived the book when I was writing it, and Mallory lived the book when I was writing it as well, because she was reading it while I was writing it, and she was listening while I talked about it. She was listening as I complained about it, and as I said, this isn't working, and she was saying, yes, it is. In the back of her mind, she was like, maybe it's not. But, she always believed in it, and she's made incredible sacrifices to support me and to support our family. We have 2 little girls at home who are at home alone without us for the first time in their lives. They are with my mom, so fingers crossed that they're asleep or heading towards sleep right now. But Mallory has made incredible sacrifices, and I'm probably not as aware of them as I should be, but I'll try. So thank you. So tonight I want to start by talking a little bit about Shannon and about Charles and how kind they are to join me tonight. You know, I'm a realist writer. I try to write about the world that is, not the world that I want it to be. So for example, my mom, I was raised Southern Baptist, which means I can't dance. And I talk really loud when I get excited. My mom would pull me aside when she was reading A Land More Kind Than Home, and she'd say, I love your book. I love it. It's just so good. But why do you have to say shit? I mean, that moment when he punches that guy in the face and he feels his nose crunch under his knuckles, couldn't he be like, shoot, that hurt, right? Shoot. And I said, Mom, I'm sorry. I write about the world that is, not the world that I want it to be or the world that you want it to be. And once when I was a child, my mom was pulling out of the garage and ran over a paint can, and it sprayed paint all over the wall, and she screamed, shit, damn, fire. So I said, Mom, at least I left those out. I just went with the shit. I could have had him be like, shit, damn, fire, that hurt, punching that man's nose. And so I'm a writer. I'm a realist writer, and I try to create the world for the reader. And all writing is an act of failing. There's no way I'm going to give you the world. You live in the world. I cannot give you the world on the page. I can't condense human experience and the world to the page, but I can try. But even in my trying, I know I'm going to fail. But one thing I try to do as a writer, I try to appeal to all of your senses. And Shannon was so kind tonight. She said when she was reading the last ballad, she felt that she could smell the cabin Ella May lived in with her children. She could hear the machinery in the textile mill where Ella works. So I'm really trying to appeal to your senses. But you know, recent developments in neuroscience and other research and things that I don't understand has shown us that there are senses we don't often understand and senses we may not even be aware of in that concrete way that we are aware of our 5 senses. And those senses are interoception and proprioception is what they're called. And interoception is an awareness of your body, how your body feels. Do I feel full? Do I feel nauseous? Do I feel dizzy? Do I feel bloated? Do I feel like I've been traveling all day? It's just your body checking in and saying, how do I feel? And then proprioception is your body's awareness in space. You know, how do I know I'm on a stage surrounded by people, that the microphone is right here? I can't smell it. I'm not touching it. I can't see it right now, but I know it's here. I'm aware spatially of where I am. I grew up in North Carolina. And I became a writer in Western North Carolina when I came to UNC Asheville in 1996. And this place got in me in a way that it will never get out of me. And that's been one of the great joys of my life, having this place in me. But I left in 2003 and I went down to Lafayette, Louisiana to study under Ernest J. Gaines, who I believe is still the greatest living writer in the American South and maybe in the country. And I got down there and I realized my body didn't feel right. The interior, the core of my body did not feel right. I loved beef brisket. I loved Zydeco music. I loved Mardi Gras. But I missed mountains. I missed fresh water. I missed the fiddle, the way it's played in the bluegrass tradition. I missed the accents. I missed the voices. I missed the geography. And my body just felt strange. And I was aware of myself spatially in ways I had never been aware of before. I was aware of the absence of things that I had loved and taken for granted for so long. And it's dawned on me recently that so much of my life, especially then, was lived passively. When I lived in North Carolina, in Western North Carolina specifically, I lived passively. I'm like, oh, there's these mountains. I got to drive around them to get where I'm going to go. And here's all this fresh water. Just the creeks are rising when it rains too much. And here's all these seasons. And I was living passively and just eyes closed, moving through them. But then when I didn't have them, I missed them actively. I missed them with an active longing that I should have appreciated them when I was living in them in the moment. So what did I do? I listened to the music of Shannon Whitworth. I read books by people like Charles Frazier. and I got to live in two places at once. I got to live in Lafayette, Louisiana, and when I listened to Shannon's music, or I read Cold Mountain, or 13 Moons, or a Ron Rash poem, or listened to a musician like Malcolm Holcomb, I got to come back here. And it's because of people like Shannon and Charles that I had the headspace and the heart space to write A Land More Kind Than Home. And it's such an honor to have them with me tonight. I can't express the depth of my gratitude that they would come here and do something like this with me. But we're not here to talk about them, are we? We're here to talk about Ella Mae Wiggins. So the last ballad tells the story of a 28-year-old woman who was swept up in a violent mill strike in the summer of 1929. When the novel opens, our heroine, Ella Mae Wiggins, is sitting in the office of American Mill Number 2. And she's sitting outside the office. She's been called off the line, so she knows she's done something wrong. She's waiting to get some bad news. Will she be fired? Will she be reprimanded? Because she missed the shift the night before because her 3-year-old daughter has whooping cough and she's sick. And Ella works the night shift. She works 72 hours a week at night, and she makes $9 a week. And her children are sick at night because they have whooping cough. And last night she stayed home. And she knows she's been called off the line. That's going to set her back on the Hank clock because her output's measured. Her pay depends on that. And she's sitting there and she says, why am I here? Then the larger question becomes, how did I get here? Ella Mae Wiggins was from the mountains of East Tennessee, moved to the mountains of western North Carolina. When she was a young girl, her father worked in the lumber camps. She heard about these great promises of the good life in the mills down in the Piedmont in the South Carolina upstate, and she's left home. During the course of that time, she's given birth. My fictional Ella Mae has given birth to 5 children. She's lost one of them already, a young boy. Her husband's run off and left her. She lives in a predominantly African-American community in Bessemer City, North Carolina. She makes $9 for a 72-hour work week in the mill, and she's literally dying. She's starving, and her children are dying, and she's barely hanging on. And she asks herself, how did I get here? Why me? Why now? Why here? Why not the mountains? Why not the places I know? Why not the music I know? Why not the people I love? Why here? There's an old line from a mill writer, a guy who wrote great mill songs named Dave McCarran. He said, I can't make the money to move away. And Ella was one of those people. Ella was one of those people who came down from the mountains and got shackled to a system of poverty that kept her in place. She could not afford to leave and start over. And so when the novel opens, she's sitting outside this mill. And when she's sitting there, and she knows that Goldberg's brother, the mill, American Mill Number 2, is owned by 2 brothers from Latvia, she knows they're going to ask her, why'd you miss last night's shift? You can't miss shifts. They know she's going to ask her that. But in her pocket, she's got a union leaflet. And these union leaflets have been coming through the mill the past couple of days, and they're coming from over in Gastonia at the Lorre Mill, where the National Textile Workers Union has organized a strike. And they've demanded things like a $20 week pay, a 40-hour work week, equal work for equal pay across gender lines, an end to the Hank clock, an end to piecework, recognition of the union. And Ella Mae's touching this union leaflet in her pocket, waiting to go see what Goldberg's brother wants, the owner of the mill. And she's thinking, if the things on this piece of paper come true, I can live. If the things on this piece of paper come true, my children can live. Because I've already lost one, and I know I'm going to lose more, and I might not make it myself. And if things keep going this way, I'm going to die, and my children might die. But I've got this thing in my pocket, and I got a decision to make. And so I wanted to read a little bit tonight, just the first 85 pages, just to give you a sense of what the novel feels like. And then when you all buy it, you can just start on page 86, and you can be like, wow, I've read so much. I feel so accomplished. Or you can be like, I'm not going to waste my time. I fell asleep at like page 12, so I'm just going to sneak out and go have a cocktail somewhere. But I wanted to read a scene in the novel that gives you an idea of who Ella Mae was and what she was willing to do and the lengths she was willing to go to. And it also hints at this decision she had to make. A chair set in front of Goldberg's brother's desk. He did not ask Ella to sit down, so she did not sit. He pushed himself back from his desk and put his hands in his lap. His thin lips formed a straight line. "I'm glad you joined us for your shift this evening," he said. "Yes, sir," Ella said. She did not look at him when she spoke, choosing instead to focus on the other things on his desk aside from the ledger and ink pen. A small wooden globe with etchings too faded to read, an empty mug, a half-eaten sandwich of some kind, a shiny red apple. "I say that because you missed last night's shift." "Yes, sir," she said again. "Mrs. Wiggins?" he said. "It's May." Her eyes darted to his for a moment, returned to rest on the half-eaten sandwich. "What?" "It's May, Ella May." "Well, I've got Wiggins written down here." "It's May," she said again. "I told Dobbins to change it, but I guess he didn't." "Why have you been missing your shifts, Mrs. May?" "Shift," Ella said. "I just missed the one last night." "No," Goldberg's brother said, "no." He leaned toward his desk, picked up a clipboard, flipped through a sheath of papers. "No, you missed one in January and you missed one in March." "It's been a long time since March," Ella said. "Even longer since January." "That's not the point," he said. "Why are you missing shifts?" "I got a sick little girl at home. She gets bad at night. And I had to stay home," she said. "I asked Dobbins to put me on day shift, but he won't do it. Maybe I should have asked you." "Dobbins handles shift change requests," he said. "Well, he didn't handle mine," Ella said. "And now he told me to come down here, and that's just going to set me back even more." Goldberg's brother leaned back in his chair, placed his hands in his lap again. Ella stared at the sandwich, tried to judge what kind of meat rested between the slices of bread. "You have a sick little girl," he said. "Yes, sir." "Please look at me, Mrs. May. I can't tell whether or not you're being truthful unless you look at me." She lifted her eyes to his, saw that he stared at her intently, saw that her missed shift must mean a great deal to him. But she knew it meant even more to her, because she would not be paid. Why wouldn't I be truthful? "I don't know, Mrs. May. People often don't tell the truth when they lay out of work. Sick means drunk. Sick means gambling. Sick means lazy. I don't know what a sick little girl means." She felt the blood rush to her face, knew that her cheeks were flush with color. Her guilt, or whatever it was she had just felt, faded. She imagined throwing herself across the desk, reaching for his neck, his eyes. "Sick means my little girl is sick," she said. "That's what it means." He stared at her for a moment, then lifted a wastebasket from beneath his desk and swept the sandwich and apple into it. He returned the wastebasket to the floor. "What if all my employees had sick children, Mrs. May? What about me? What if I had a sick child at home and decided that I couldn't come to work? Who'd run this mill?" Ella had never seen Goldberg's brother's family, knew nothing about them aside from their existence and the existence of the older brother. She had never been inside the Goldbergs' large brick home, and she had never met anyone who'd been inside it either. She envisioned electric lights and running water and warm blankets and bed sheets and a pantry full of food and a cooler full of ice, a pair of soft, warm slippers tucked beneath a neatly made bed. A baby might cry out somewhere upstairs, and a nurse or a maid or a young cousin would ascend a grand curved staircase and open a nursery door and whisper something kind and reassuring to the child inside. "Yes, sir," Ella said. "Who'd run this mill?" Goldberg's brother asked again. "Nobody." "That's correct. Nobody. And you know who runs your spinners when you decide to lay out on a shift? Nobody." He leaned forward again. "But I can assure you of this, Mrs. Wiggins. It'll be much easier to find someone to operate your spinners than it will be to find someone to run this mill. I expect you'll keep that in mind next time you find yourself with a desire to stay home." So you can imagine what decision Ella makes after an encounter like that. She's got this union leaflet in her pocket, and it's invited her and the other people who would come across it to a rally the next day. And Ella goes to this rally, and she tells her story. She meets some strike organizers who are from up north, Yankees, and they're communist. This strike is a communist-led strike. Not communist like people with some liberal ideas, but communist from Moscow. Moscow, it's the American Communist Party is leading this strike. And Ella tells her story to one of the organizers. And the woman says, "Hot damn, you can sing too? You're who we've been looking for." And that night they convince Ella to get up on stage and sing a song that she had written on the back of that Union leaflet, based on the melody of a popular song called Little Mary Fagan. And that song was called Mill Mother's Lament. That song went on to be performed by Woody Guthrie. This is stepping out of the novel and into real life. That song went on to be performed by Woody Guthrie, who called her one of the greatest American songwriters of all time. It was recorded by Pete Seeger. That summer, in my novel and in real life, Ella May would join the Union. She would organize her African-American co-workers in Stumptown, where she lived in Bessemer City. She would travel to Washington, D.C. and confront North Carolina senators about the plight of working mothers and children in southern mills. And she would integrate the labor union. On June 6th of that summer, there was a raid on the strikers' headquarters, and shots were fired. There was great dispute historically over who fired the shots, who fired the first shots. But when the smoke cleared, the police chief had been shot, and he later died. A couple of dozen strikers were rounded up and arrested, and they stood trial that fall. Most of them were northern organizers from Massachusetts and New Jersey and New York. On September 14th, Ella was traveling with some of her fellow strikers from Bessemer City to Gastonia in support of these jailed strikers to attend a rally. And they were met by a roadblock made up of men from this secret committee that had been funded by the mill to terrorize the strikers by raiding their headquarters, by destroying their food stores, by raiding the strikers' tent city, by kidnapping them and driving them out to the country, by waiting at the train station and turning around anybody who looked like a Union sympathizers, especially African Americans. These men met them at the bridge going into Gastonia. They demanded Ella's caravan turned around, and they did. Ella's caravan, all of them were unarmed. She insisted on them being unarmed. And later, this group of men loaded up in trucks, and they ran Ella's caravan off the road. Shots were fired. Ella was shot, and she was killed. And legend holds that her last words were something to the effect of, "Oh Lordy, they have shot me." Ella May disappeared from history. The real Ella May had given birth to 9 children. 4 of them had died. I thought a contemporary reader couldn't swallow that. There's no way you can conceptualize somebody losing 4 children and continuing on with their lives. But Ella May's surviving children was swept away to an orphanage. And her story, the story of the strike, the tragedy of her life, the story of her struggle, disappeared from Gastonia history, North Carolina history, and American history. Although on the day of her murder made headlines around the world, Gastonia swallowed it up. And I grew up there knowing nothing about it, about this woman who was a feminist before that term was coined. She was a civil rights leader before we knew what that meant, and they killed her for it. But her music lives, and hopefully, in my small way, she'll live on in this novel. But Shannon is going to perform Ella's best-known song, Mill Mother's Lament.
We leave our home in the morning, we kiss our children goodbye, while we slave for the bosses, our children scream and cry. And when we draw our money, our grocery bills to pay, not a cent to spend on clothing, not a cent to stay away. And on that very evening, our little son will say, "I need some shoes, Mama, and so does Sister May." grieves the heart of a woman, you everyone should know. That we can't find for our children, our wages are too low. It is for our little children, for us they seem so dear, but for us and for the workers, the bosses do not care. But understand our workers, a union they do feel. Let's stand together and have a union here. Let's stand together and have a union here.
Thank you. That was perfect.
Thanks.
That's how I would describe that. That was perfect. So our next event of the evening is I'm going to be joined by Charles Frazier. Y'all may have heard of a book called Cold Mountain. I remember something about it. Just a very small, independent book that had some success. But Charles is the author of some really fantastic fiction. It's Appalachian fiction, but it's universal in its themes of love and obsession and uncertainty and place. I met Charles last summer. Malaprops organized an HB2 event where some writers from North Carolina came and read our HB2 literature. And I knew Charles was going to be there, and I'd never met him before, so I was like terrified, right? Terrified. And you never know what to expect from people, who've had the level of success and notoriety that Charles has had. But he was one of the kindest, most easygoing, genuine people I've ever met. And it's been a pleasure to get to know him and have a lot of things in common with him. We both have daughters. He has one and I have two. And we're both married to incredibly strong women. And I hope that people are aware of people like Charles Frazier in our literary community and the things they do for other writers and the things they do for people like me. And it's an honor to welcome him to the stage.
So, I'm really happy to be here and help celebrate the publication of Wiley's book. I thought maybe we would talk a little bit of writer talk. I wanted to ask him about process and about, with historical fiction, I've always thought of it as a little bit like science fiction, in that you're creating a world that we didn't experience. You've got to try to make that world seem believable and real and detailed and fully fleshed out. And I know sometimes I find some little detail and it just kind of explodes in my head and leads a little tiny bit of historic detail or can lead you in a whole different direction of the book or help you understand the book you're writing better. Did you have any of those kind of aha moments in your research?
I wish I'd had more. The aha moment in writing is like the most delicious experience you can have. And I always tell people when I have one of those aha moments where something comes together and something works, I immediately jump up from my desk and I go for a walk or I go run an errand, and I just bask in that moment of like something mystical being unlocked and something seeming real. And then when I go back to my desk, I can still enter that like metaphysical space where it feels right and it feels, perfect for me to continue on. But I think in Last Ballad, if there were moments, I was really fortunate because I was reading this book and I'd had access to a lot of incredible reference materials at libraries like Ramsey Library, the library at Chapel Hill. But I also had access to these places because they were real. The Luray Mill is real. I'll be there Thursday night doing an event. The mill that Ella May worked at, American Mill No. 2, is real. The place where she lived in Bessemer City, Stumptown, is real. But I felt like the moment you're talking about where the novel really opened up to me on an emotional level was when I looked at photos taken by a photographer named Lewis Hine, who is one of the people responsible for having child labor laws take effect. He traveled throughout the South, the North as well, and photographed children in textile mills around 1910. And the photos of these babies, these children, 8, 9, 10 years old, who had clearly lied about their age. There were quotes, Ma says I'm 14. I don't know how old I am. Children missing fingers, children missing arms, because they wanted people with small hands. They wanted small women. They wanted children to reach into these machines and clean these machines out and fix these problems, because they didn't want to shut down and that they could start too soon and you could lose something. But I think the minute I saw Hine's photos, I understood the depth of sorrow that had touched these people's lives. And I understood the struggle to leave that life, but also the overwhelming awareness that you couldn't. And I think in terms of historical research, seeing those photos just really spoke to my heart in a way that something on the page couldn't have.
I've always been fascinated by the Milltown culture. My grandfather, who was born about 1879, worked in mills for just a few years when he was a teenager in upstate South Carolina. And I can remember
Where in South Carolina, do you know?
It was somewhere near Seneca, but not Seneca. When I was a little kid, like 8 or 9 years old, I remember going down with him one time. He just wanted to go back and visit the places where he grew up. And we went in one of those that was still in operation, and I have clear memories of that. I'm interested in the culture of those mill towns, and particularly things like the string bands that travel the cotton mill circuits and that kind of thing. Did you do much reading in that direction?
I did a little bit. Mill culture, especially in the Piedmont and the South Carolina upstate, was booming around the time they lured people like Ella May and her husband John down out of the hills. Because World War I, we're on the verge of entering World War I, the economy is humming along, and there's a need for cotton cloth. And so they don't have enough workers, and so they're luring people up into the mountains. They're sending barkers up into the mill, and they're saying, come down to the mill village. We'll give you a house, we'll give you a church, we'll give you a school, we'll give you a job, we'll give you a store, we'll give you all these things. All you have to do is work. It's going to be the easy life. Up here you're farming, you're working in the lumber camp. The lumber camps are about to close because the Smokies is coming in. And so these people, they need cash, and they left home and they went down to the mill villages. But then after the war was over, the need for cotton cloth dried up. And it's cliche to say this, but the Roaring 20s, dresses got smaller, suits got tighter, and there was less of a demand, and the economy literally churned to a halt. And so what you have are these fiercely independent people from Appalachia that weren't used to relying on people, suddenly relying on people. And they brought their music with them, and that music mingled with the more country kind of old-time music in the Piedmont and some of the old-time music there. And so you have this incredible mill culture that blossomed from it. But it was also a kind of a fretful place as well, because you have, a certain amount of African-American former slaves or freedmen at this time. In the early part of the 20th century, you've got people from Appalachia, you've got people from farms, and it was combustible. I mean, it was violent. There's a part in the novel that talks about Ella May. It says Charlie, her boyfriend at the time, had hit her. She'd hit him. He showed up at her house drunk one time, and she chased him off with a knife. She knows she's tough. She has to be tough to survive this. And so I think mill culture at different times. My parents were both born in mill villages, and my mom has very good memories of being born in a mill village. And my dad has memories of going down to the mill store and operating the mill store while the owner pushed the dope wagon through the mill at different shift changes. And so they have really good memories. But my parents were born in the 40s and grew up in the 50s. You know, the struggles of the Depression had kind of passed by then in many ways, and they weren't part of this time LMA lived in.
Yeah, I'd started a book one time that would. I imagined that the reason my grandfather, as a late teenager, very young man, left there and came up to the mountains, is probably a romantic idea, but I felt like he was trying to escape that.
Oh, sure.
And to go to Haywood County up the Pigeon River would have been about as far from the inside of one of those mills as you could get. He told stories about the roughness of it, and he was a big guy, and told about sort of people always wanting the two biggest guys to fight.
Sure. Oh, sure. Yeah.
That kind of thing. I had this. I actually wrote like 7 pages of this book, and I still kind of.
Can I have them if you don't need them? Can you just give them to me? That'd be.
It's like
I'm getting you all these readers, Charles. Come on, it's the least you could do.
Yeah, it's like a guy who's lost his hand in one of those machines is walking up the mountains, coming across Wagon Road Gap, going to come to Asheville and pay back the rich guy who's staying, at a place like the Grove Park Inn. It was going to be real violent, violent.
Finish that as soon as you can. That sounds brilliant.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing. So I want to ask a question for you. When you wrote Cold Mountain, it's a historical novel. 13 Moons, historical novel. Night Woods, and it's not set in contemporary America, so there's historical, kind of responsibilities there. And then, the new novel you're working on. But do you feel like when you're writing these novels set at a particular time that you're thinking about contemporary things and that it's influencing how you're seeing?
And I think even if you weren't trying to do it, it would happen anyway. That all the stuff that's churning in the culture right now. Well, it's like I've always thought the Scarlet Letter had a lot more to do with 19th century America than the Puritan era in New England. That you just can't really help it if you're writing about something that you have a deep feeling about. The life you live is going to be a big part of it. I think one reason I like to write about things that happened in the past, the world of the past, is that it gives me some distance from it. I mean, the most horrifying thing to me would be to write a memoir.
Sure. Sure.
And the writing in history gives you that little bit of a step away from yourself that I find necessary.
And I think you're right. I think history, I feel like there's a certain safety. This is my 3rd book, and the first 2 weren't as historical. They were set at specific times, but I wasn't having to talk about period dress and period technology and things like that. And I think in some ways there's a comfort with like a fixed moment in history, but there's also a great responsibility to get it right. And I found myself researching it to death and just putting off the writing because I wanted to know exactly which buckles were on which kinds of shoes and stuff that's not so important. Just say shoes instead of the buckles that are on the shoes. But at the same moment, what I've been struck by in writing, The Last Ballad, or having written The Last Ballad, is that we tend to think of history as a fixed thing, as history being one story. On this day, this thing happened. But this thing that happened to a lot of people. It was a fixed thing for one person at a time, and there are multiple stories. There are histories of one event. There's not a history of a single event. And I'm wondering about, especially in Cold Mountain, when you're bouncing back and forth between these perspectives, and you're giving this portrayal of the history of these two people, not just the time, but of their experiences.
Well, I mean, one thing, when I started that book, I really didn't want to write about the Civil War. I wanted to write about here, and what was happening here. That not all that many people owned slaves compared to the flatland South. My ancestors didn't, and I was partly wanting to know, or at least to think about, why would they have volunteered for that? Well, and with 13 Moons, I grew up in Andrews, really pretty close to the Tukwila boundary and really close to Snowbird. And I realized when I was, like 45 years old, that I really didn't understand how the Eastern Band of Cherokee managed to stay here. So a lot of that book was just trying to understand that historic process.
And I think a lot of me writing The Last Ballad and was trying to understand 1929. This is a story that I didn't grow up hearing about. And several months ago, I was back in Stumptown in Bessemer City looking for where, and Christine, if she's here tonight, she probably knows off the top of her head, but I was trying to find where Ella Mae's cabin was, because according to history, she lived near a fresh spring. And I was just kind of walking around Stumptown, these people sitting on their porches, asking them, like, hey, is there any fresh water around here? And I'm sure they were like, why do you want to know? You're going to pee in it? Like, who asked a question like that? We were in Shepherdstown, West Virginia last week, and we got lost, and it's like the darkest little village. You were there last year. It's the darkest. It's like this at night. And we couldn't find the Airbnb we rented, and I was going up to people saying things like, excuse me, I'm not crazy, which is what crazy people say when they want you to trust them, But I was walking around Stumptown, and I met this couple sitting on their porch, and I said, I'm looking for this house, and they said, why? And I told them the story of Ella Mae Wiggins, and they said, why did we not know this story? And I said, I don't know. And the woman said, I worked at Luray. I'm from Bessemer City, and I worked at Luray. I never heard of Ella Mae Wiggins. Nobody talked about the strike. And then she sat back, and she said, you know what? It was about a time when poor black people and poor white people got together, and they didn't want to tell me that story. They didn't want to teach that story when I was a kid. And that story's been kept. That history of that day, it was swallowed, and it was taken away. And that was something that made a huge impact on me. So thinking about when a novel is written, I thought I was writing a novel about 1929, about this tough, independent woman who's calling for unity to stand up to the forces of greed. And I was coming to the end of writing this novel last fall when we were watching a campaign cycle unfold in which a tough, independent woman calling for unity was standing up to the forces of greed, right? And And that's not a smear against our president, because I think he would be like, yeah, that's me. Thank you. I appreciate the compliment. And the day after the election, I thought, America doesn't want to read a novel about a tough, independent woman calling for unity, standing up to the forces of greed. But the day after the election, and every day since the day after the election, I feel like America is saying we want to read a novel about a tough, independent woman standing up to these forces. And I thought I was writing a novel about 1929, but after Charlottesville, the things that unfolded in Charlottesville happened in Charlotte when there was a raid on the strikers' headquarters. The way Heather Heyer was killed, that's how Ella Mae was killed. I thought I was writing a novel about 1929, but I wrote a novel about 2017. And in understanding 1929 and all these competing ideologies and this panic, I understand a little bit more about 2017, and I'm wondering if you felt that way, writing 13 Moons about division and people moving out and trying to hold on to the past and trying to hold on to that moment, if you understood something about the contemporary moment in which you wrote it.
With that one, I don't know that I felt so much connection to the present day, other than trying to understand how the land here, how from Buncombe County west, how that changed hands from Cherokee people to my people. How did my ancestors end up in Haywood County and Buncombe County? How did so many of the Cherokee people who'd been here for probably thousands of years end up in Oklahoma, except for that little group? So it was a little bit, or more than a little bit, trying to understand my roots
Was
here.
it something people just didn't talk about? It was just an accepted thing?
Well, I bet when I was growing up over in Andrews, if you talked to, if I was as a kid asked a teacher or adults, how did that come to be? I bet people wouldn't have known.
Sure.
Because it's complicated, and it ends up being a really kind of simple matter of property rights. That group got to stay. They owned their land,
Sure.
So they got to stay.
Do you want to try taking some questions? We thought about taking questions from the audience, but I can't see anyone to see if anybody is going to ask any questions. If anybody wants to...
There we go. There are people out there.
That was so theatric. It felt like, amazing. Does anybody have any questions before Shannon's going to come and sing one more song? And then I would love to sign as many books as y'all would like for me to sign. And if you have any questions that you don't want to ask in this crowded auditorium, I would love if you wanted to ask them at the table or later tonight. But does anybody have any questions for either of us about writing or the business of writing or anything like that? What was the role of the churches? Well, many of the churches were funded by the mill. And many of the churches were towing the company line. I can't quite tell who asked that question, but many of the churches were towing the company line. And it was a really interesting moment, but many of the holiness churches and the Pentecostal churches were these radical churches, where the oral tradition was very strong, where they were telling stories, and they were telling stories of their poverty. But many of the state churches were towing the company line and telling people to sit quiet and set up your store in heaven. And you don't need to bathe every day. It wasn't godly to bathe every day because many of these houses didn't have running water. And so in many instances, the churches were complicit in keeping this system going because the mill paid their bottom line. They were funded by the mills. There's a great study of mill hands and preachers by a guy named Liston Pope that came out, maybe in the 50s. It's a wonderful study of how the church has influenced mill life and vice versa. Anyone else? Yes.
I just think it's really interesting on your news article from Gaston. Have been written in the last few months. The same kind of rhetoric about what we're fighting against. It's just really that maybe not so historical.
Sure. She mentioned the newspaper articles that are in the front part of the book and sprinkled throughout. Many of those are verbatim, the stuff that the Gaston Gazette was printing. And I changed the name of the Gaston Gazette, and they thankfully gave me permission to reprint some of those. Some of them are slightly tinkered with to fit my characters or my moments or whatever. But the Gaston Gazette editorial was running violently confrontational articles. Every American must do his duty. Take your stand. They're here to kill you. They're here to steal your property. They're here to make your kids go to school with black children. They're here to intermarry. They're here to push free love. And it was this rallying cry that sought to divide, to divide, to divide. And the history of poor people aligning is the history of the upper classes trying to divide, to sow division among those people. One of the best-kept secrets in North Carolina political history is the Fusionist Party. After the failure of Reconstruction, poor white farmers and poor free blacks got together and said, hey, we got a lot more in common. Our poverty unites us a lot more than our race divides us. Let's form a political party. And it gained some traction. And they had some success in elections. And then you began to see the rise of lynching. You begin to see the rise of white fear, of instilling fear in white women that black men are coming from you. And people like you see the anti-Dwyer lynching bill, which was a bill that made lynching a federal crime. And you see Senator Lee Overman from Salisbury filibuster that bill for hours and hours and hours. Well, Lee Overman shows up in my novel, and Ella May gives him the business, because she did give him the business in real life. In D.C., she found him. She sought him out. And so these newspaper articles were real, and the spirit behind them was real. And this call for division is powerful, and it's poisonous, and it works. It worked in Gastonia. Yes, sir. Where would I recommend finding her music? You know, Pete Seeger recorded Mill Mother's Lament on his Industrial Ballads album. Some of her music you can find it in verse. Christina Horton, her book, Martyr of Dolores Mill, a few of Ella's songs and some of the songs that she wrote and some of the songs that she sang are printed in the back. But to my knowledge, no recording of Ella singing exists. There are only a very few photos of Ella that actually exist. So to my knowledge, you can't find her music except as performed by other people. Yes?
I have a question for Mr. Frazier, actually.
Okay.
Do you feel that something was lost in the adaptation of your novel when they took, as they do, I know, both Dickens did a fine job, but do you feel something was lost there?
Well, as you ask that, running through my mind was a conversation I had with Jim Harrison before. This was after Legends of the Fall had been made into a movie and before Cold Mountain had been made. And I asked him what he thought of Legends of the Fall, and he said, same thing you're going to think about your movie. Too pretty.
Too pretty.
So there was that element of it. And, you know, I mean, Anthony Minghella said when he first started writing the screenplay, he said he blocked it out like he was going to film the entire thing. And he said it would be a 9-hour movie. So he said, you know, you're going to have to recognize a lot's going to go. And that is the case. It's keeping the right stuff, and I'm in general happy with it. Too pretty.
I've heard other writers say when they make a movie of your book, and it's a great movie, you say, "Gosh, look at my movie," and if it's a bad movie, they say, "Man, they made a bad movie," and you can embrace it or distance it. Maybe one more question, and Shannon's going to come back out and perform another song for us. Does anybody have maybe one more? Yes. I discovered the story of Ella May when I went to graduate school in Lafayette, Louisiana in 2003. You know, I grew up in Gastonia. I'm from the Mills in Gastonia. My family's from the Mills. And I never heard of the Laurier Mill strike. Laurier was purchased by Firestone. I believe it was in 1938. They changed the name to Firestone Mill, changed the name to Laurier to the streets around to Firestone streets and things like that. And so I started looking it up, and I realized that I had not been taught about this most significant labor struggle in the history of my state, maybe in the history of the South, maybe in the history of the country. I mean, when the police chief was murdered, Orville Adderholt, Gastonia made the headlines in every major newspaper around the world. Same with Ella May, and she was roundly slandered by newspapers in the state. And just like that, she was gone. She was disappeared from history. There's a lot of disappearing in this book, a lot of people being snuffed from history, their stories being snuffed from history. And my grandfather was from Innery, South Carolina, which is right, my grandmother was from Cowpens where Ella May settles at the beginning of the book, and the real Ella May settles. My grandfather was 22 years old. His last name was Wiggins, when a woman who shared his last name was murdered just a few miles north in Gastonia. And he never talked about it. He never told my mom about it. He never told me about it. People just swallowed it. And it was this terribly divisive moment in the history of the state. And I believe the city of Gastonia had the historical marker for the Laurier Mill strike. I think it was in the city's possession for over 10 years before they could decide to put it up. That's recent. It's recent. It's not like that was in 1930. It was like in 2000. They took 10 years to put it up. because it's still incredibly divisive. It's still incredibly painful, and it's still very real. And I'll be there Thursday night, so if you're a prayer, pray for me. I go into the hornet's nest. Shannon?
Yeah, sure. I want to say such an honor to be here and to celebrate an amazing book, The Last Ballad. And I got a sneaky copy of it a little ways back, and y'all need to grab your copy and savor it. It's a powerful, powerful novel. And thank you.
Thank you, Shannon.
I follow all the old back roads to a place that I call home. The air is sweet and the mountains weep on while I run. Blow my mind across these words that rhyme and sing. Blow my hands around these toes, walk me back to me. Close to you, close to me, close to what I love, what I want, what I don't. Sing with like a lonely dove. Walk these hills in the rain, I'll ride out all this pain. Lie here, sleep off all your love. You're all I'm thinking of. So I follow all the old back roads to a place that I call home. Where the air is sweet and the mountains weep on while I run. Walk these hills in the rain, I'll ride out all this pain. Lie here, sleep off all your love. You're all I'm thinking of.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is an incredibly special night for me, and one I'm never gonna forget. So thank you, Shannon, that was perfect, and thank you to Charles. There are books for sale in the lobby. I would love to sign every one of them. I want to recognize the Literacy Council of Buncombe County for also being here tonight. There are people here, I believe there's some information here. Literacy plays a big role in my novel. Ella May discovered this union pamphlet at a time when not everyone could read. We still live in a time when not everyone can read. 10% of adults in North Carolina struggle with basic literacy. Ella's husband was illiterate. Census records tell us that. Ella could read, and she read that union ballad, and it set her free. So support literacy. Thank you.
Cause we swim upstream till it pulls us down. We will reach the shore though before we drown. Look no further through the eyes of hell. Man with a gun is gonna kill this sweet girl with untied hair. She loved a man who never cared.